Our special guest tonight is John Anderson. I first met him, I think, back in about 2013 at the World Congress of Families in Sydney. John has spent 19 years from 1989 in the Australian Parliament and served as Deputy Prime Minister for 6 years between 1999 and 2005 under John Howard. He was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2011 and a Companion in 2022. So I'm not sure if that's Sir John Anderson or Right Honourable John Anderson. But anyway, we think he rocks because he's just doing some amazing podcasts. He's speaking up in the social conservative world where so many politicians aren't. And we thought he would be perfect for this special dinner. So would you give a warm Kiwi welcome to John Anderson?
My friends, I believe that we are living at a civilisational moment, and I would like to talk to you in all seriousness about it tonight. I am not particularly brilliant and wouldn't claim to be, except to say that I did choose my parents carefully. They were Australians, and that's not much difference in the end to New Zealanders, so don't take that one personally. They were rural Australians, so I grew up on a farm. And I chose the time of my entry into the world very well. I was extremely clever, I thought, because it was well after the Second World War, and I was too young, in fact, for the Vietnam era, which was very divisive in Australia, and I think probably here as well. But I was very aware as I grew up that my father had, in fact, lived through a civilisational moment. He had fought with the famous 9th Division in the North African desert against Rommel. And in General Montgomery's massive pushback against Rommel that finally saw the first significant Allied victory of the Second World War, my father was horrendously injured to the point where his friends were told he would not see the night out, and they couldn't say goodbye to him because he was in an oxygen tent and unconscious. That was a civilisational moment. We were talking on our table a moment ago. Had that war been lost, none of us would have been here tonight. The way of life that we have taken for granted would have been smashed, lost. A different era altogether. We now face another civilisational moment, I think. I say that because I think we are certainly facing the most extraordinary global challenges from what a former Australian Prime Minister recently called the arc of autocracy, a range of quite ugly players who do not believe in the global order that has essentially secured freedom and prosperity for so many human beings since the end of the Second World War. They don't believe in it. They believe in a very different model. But it is worse than that. We are eating ourselves out from within. I asked the world's most prominent economic historian some years ago on my video podcast series, Neil Ferguson, what he saw as the three greatest threats to our freedom. And he said, in ascending order, extremist Islamic terrorism, followed by the possibility of miscalculation between the superpower of the day and the rising superpower. But the greatest threat to our freedoms is, in fact, our own self-loathing, our denial of our history, our belief that we are a blot somehow on the face of humanity. It is an extraordinary thing that we have come to this point, but we have. We are in the midst of a revolution. And in an attempt tonight to put out some big, broad brushstrokes, in an attempt to, if you like, take a bird's eye view of how we have got to where we are, and with acknowledgements to my very good friend Os Guinness, some of you may know him as a Christian apologist from the Guinness brewing family, who lives and works in America and has written extensively. One of his more recent books is called The Magna Carta of Humanity. I recommend it to you. If you do nothing else, read the introduction and chapter 7. I want to talk about 3 revolutions tonight. What is a revolution? It is something whereby that which was on top is replaced and put to the bottom, that which was on the bottom becomes the top. And the three revolutions are very distinct in character, though two are very closely related, one having given birth to the other. The first has given rise to human freedom and flourishing, never perfect, but has done so better than any other. The second has given rise to horrendous oppression, cruelty, and loss of life. And the third revolution, if we're not careful, will do to the first revolution what the second revolution has done to freedom. What am I talking about? Broadly speaking, what might be called the Sinai revolutions, the ones that really derived, if you like, and Jordan Peterson's writing about this in a very interesting way more recently, derived from Exodus, the concept of let my people go, set my people free, enter into covenants, so much better than contracts, where we each bring something to the table, where we recognise the worth and the value of all. That essentially is a British idea from the Magna Carta on, translated through the American Revolution and into their system of government and the way they wrote their constitution, and which has massively shaped the modern world, in particular those countries that might be seen as the products of the mother of the parliaments, Britain. And I would include America loosely in that, despite the fact that in some ways their revolution was anti-British. It picked up the same concepts of respect for the worth and the dignity of each individual and devised a democratic model to reflect that ideal. It was never an easy process at all. But in the pursuit of freedom, I might shortcut by asking a question, what is freedom? And then move to what I see as the four pillars of freedom that we have established as a stool upon which Western civic and economic life has rested since. What is freedom? I think I would go with Isaiah Berlin on this. Now, he was an extraordinary Jewish philosopher who worked at Oxford. Some of you will know something of his works. Forgive me if I'm preaching to the choir tonight. As I said, broad brush approaches only. There is a famous story about him. Winston Churchill asked to meet Isaiah Berlin, and his minders got it wrong and brought him Irving Berlin, the American composer. And there was an awkward moment when they met and realised that something had gone wrong. But Churchill found something witty to say. He always did. Extraordinary person, really. None of us would be here without him tonight. George Bernard Shaw once asked him to the opening night of one of his shows in London in the days when there were 8 return posts in a day. So Churchill got his invitation. Dear Winston, my opening, first night of my new show tonight, 2 tickets enclosed, one for you, one for a friend if you have one. And Churchill, by return mail, sent back a letter that said, regret cannot make tonight, will come to your second night, in brackets, if you have one. But Berlin argued that freedom might be thought of in 2 ways, negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from fear of oppression, of a police state, of brutality, of invasion of your home, freedom from, if you like, anxiety, enslavement of the soul, depression, suicidal thoughts. Those are negative freedoms. And if you can establish the negative freedoms, you can move on to the positive freedoms, the freedom to become what you might achieve, if you like, to reach your potential. Unfortunately, it is usually seen as freedom to do what you like. That sort of freedom rapidly develops into license, and so freedom becomes its own enemy. Freedom becomes the enemy of freedom. But freedom properly understood as, I think, no less a figure than G.K. Chesterton said, is the freedom to do what you ought. And I think Templeton said something along the same lines, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He at one stage in his life was quite a soapbox orator and enjoyed Hyde Park Corner, you know, the Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park, you've probably all heard of it, where people would get up in the days before social media and make their points, whether it was from the left or the right, the atheists or the Christians. And he was up there one day extolling the virtues of temperance, of not drinking. And there was a drunk in the audience who kept saying, "Hey, come on," he said, "that mate of yours, St Paul, he liked a tipple," referring to Paul's encouragement of Timothy to have a little wine to settle his stomach. And so this drunk's intent upon interrupting at one stage, he said, "Come on, he liked the drink, didn't he?" To which Templeton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, reputedly replied, "I don't know. I'll ask him when I get there and meet him." And the drunk said, "And what if he's not there?" And Templeton replied, "Well, in that case, my good friend, you can ask him." That sort of wit's disappeared out of public life today, hasn't it? Anyway, so those are the two freedoms. Freedom from and freedom to reach your potential, do what you ought to do. And as it's evolved in our culture, 4 essential freedoms have slowly come to be understood over the last 500 years. Hasn't been a rapid process, but we've now abandoned them at an incredible rate. We're walking away from them. And the 4 freedoms might be described loosely as the freedom of conscience and belief, or freedom of religion. Freedom of speech, the one by which perhaps it might be said that you defend all other freedoms. Freedom of assembly, the right to mix with like-minded people or not to mix. It's not discriminatory. It's a freedom, properly understood. We're doing it tonight. We're not actually wanting to exclude anyone, so far as I know, Bob. But we're here because we're like-minded. What a wonderful thing to be able to do. And the other freedom is freedom of property. And that one's often overlooked. It's mentioned twice in the 10 Commandments. But it's very important. And the defence of freedom of property was understood by many of the early academics who were pursuing democratic freedoms, particularly in the great English universities. And John Fortescue argued that the right to your home, the right to sell your goods, the right to sell your abilities, to earn a living, the right to expect that if you produce 2 cabbages, one won't be taken by the state, is incredibly important to freedom and human flourishing. Likewise, the idea of freedom of conscience and belief came out of a very ugly period in Christendom when people of differing beliefs, particularly during the early Reformation days, were burning those of different views at the stake. And after a while, people realised that was unwise, because one day you may be in the minority rather than the majority, but it was also pretty ungodly. And we developed the Western genius for living with our differences. And in a way, I would argue that whilst all 4 freedoms are pegs on a stool, if you like, legs of a stool, weaken one, you weaken them all, I would say to you that perhaps the queen of the freedoms is the freedom to hold to your beliefs, provided only they do not impact negatively on others, and yet they are under full-scale attack today. So there we have it, the 4 essential freedoms that have defined the revolution that has shaped our culture and which has been so strongly supported, which has given rise to such selfishness, such nobility, that it became for so long the predominant breeding ground for freedom really across the globe. The other revolution, however, that in a sense paralleled it over the last few hundred years was, in fact, of course, the Marxist revolution, one that developed into terrible tyrannies. It's extraordinary to think that Karl Marx died on a wet and drizzly day and was buried in Highgrove Cemetery. 11 people attended his funeral, and it might have all been forgotten if it hadn't been for what happened in Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution. And those ideas have proved to be, as you know, horrendous. I think the Russian Revolution, in a sense, it needs to be remembered that Karl Marx admired the French Revolution. In a way, it started it. It was brutal. The words used to promote it were noble, but the sentiments underneath them, because of the lack of respect for other people, genuine respect, a lack of commitment to the idea of the ideals of mercy and of forgiveness and of living with differences, produced a terrible outcome for around 10 years, the reign of terror until it collapsed under Napoleon. But Marx I admired the whole movement, and it was to produce the horrors of the Russian Revolution and all that has flowed since. The Chinese Revolution, tens of millions dead, Pol Pot, many of those ideas picked up, I hate to say it, by him, those communist ideas while he was studying and working on the left bank in Paris. The antithesis of personal freedom. The third revolution really came about in the 1920s, and it was born of frustration that Western democratic capitalism was not falling quickly enough. The Frankfurt School in 1923 met to try and resolve why the working classes were not rising up and bringing down democratic capitalism. In fact, the Russian Revolution was never really brought about by working classes anyway, but that didn't seem to worry them much. A lot of effort was put into trying to work out why people were not embracing the wonderful new model of communism. And it dawned on those at the Frankfurt School that the great problems were the institutions of freedom, we would say, but they would say the institutions of oppression in the Western world, the opiate of the people, religion. So it was the churches, it was the established democratic principles, it was the family, it was the courts, it was the education system. And so you began this movement, later to become known as the March Through the Institutions. That was a much later term, but it slowly built. It built through the Italian mental block now, Gramsci, who was a great mate, of course, initially of Mussolini's, although he eventually jailed him. His ideas then taken forward more recently by other academics, including Michael Foucault, culminating in the sort of revolutionary fervour in the universities, the attempt to undermine the whole sort of Christian ethos and basis of democratic freedoms. And bit by bit, they have succeeded to an extraordinary degree. An extraordinary degree. The thinking has spread out, particularly starting in the 1960s from our universities, into our schools, into arts and drama. And so now you have, if you like, what might have been called cultural Marxism has sort of morphed all the way through to political correctness and now wokeism. Woke is an African-American term meaning that you are awakened when you realise the fundamental problem in the world is racism and that all whites are racist, particularly male whites. And it gives rise to critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical queer theory, and so forth. And one would have not thought this stuff would have taken hold, but it has taken hold in a massive way, so that we now have woke almost everything, including woke business. And it is actually cultural Marxism. So there is the third revolution. It's extraordinarily pervasive. It's amazing how unaware many people are of how this is part of a whole. We see isolated outbreaks of it in our culture. Sometimes we feel swamped by the amount of change without recognising it's a whole. It's a whole movement. It is essentially cultural Marxism. No reason we should be ashamed to use the term. They use it themselves. in their inner councils, and have since the Frankfurt School arose in 1923. It's a term they've used themselves, so why should we be embarrassed about using it because people tut-tut and say, oh, don't be silly, it doesn't exist anymore? Of course it does. And it finds its ultimate, I think, expression in Western culture now, at least on our campuses, in what is called critical thinking, which I just touched on a moment ago. It is very real. And it goes to the heart of what Neil Ferguson is talking about when he says that our great problem now is internal. We have really sort of lost our way in terms of any belief and confidence in ourselves as being forces for good in the world. And I think this is deeply concerning. We need to be aware of how broad it is, how effectively it's seeped in to so much of our national and international life in the Western world, and how, in a sense, it forms another revolution. It really does, because it is turning on its head all the old verities that we believed in. And that particularly applies to family. I do find the reasons for the denial of your tax status exemptions really deeply troubling. Deeply troubling. I find it so because up until now we've understood the astonishing importance of family and of being selfless where our children are concerned. If you've not seen it, if you've not read it, I do recommend Them Before Us by Katie Faust and Stacey Manning. It's a book well worth reading. If you don't have time for the book, you can go onto my podcast series and you'll find it there. That's just a little plug in case none of you have heard of it. But in that book, a very powerful argument is made to say that we are, in fact, in the name of what is called the modern family, suiting ourselves rather than identifying our children's needs. They are there for our benefit rather than we being there to protect them, as virtually every one of us in this room experienced in our own homes when our parents made extraordinary sacrifices for us. It's almost the other way around now. Our children are to be held up as trophies to our way of life and our belief system rather than their interests being put first. This is astonishingly selfish and astonishingly limiting in terms of our belief in our own culture and its future. Indeed, you might argue that it is a result of an almost total loss of belief in and faith in our own belief and in our own culture. And yet I would argue, show me a better model. Which political system, devised down through the ages, has developed greater human flourishing and opportunity and freedom than ours? While ever we've been prepared to live within certain boundaries, to accept responsibilities, to be good citizens. Often in America you'll hear people quote, when they're talking about democracy, Lincoln saying democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. You've all heard that? What they perhaps don't know is that Lincoln was quoting a sermon that he'd heard in an institution called church, because most people in America went to church at that time only a few weeks ago. And perhaps what he hadn't realised was that the sermon, the preacher was quoting a great Oxford thinker who had said in the 14th century that if we are to be good citizens and enjoy anything approaching freedom, we must exercise self-restraint in the first place. We must be model citizens. Now, we seem to be determined to be totally indulgent citizens, totally committed to our own comfort and our own daily pursuits rather than looking after our neighbour. And our most important neighbour is surely our children. And so it is that it's worth remembering that no less a research institution than, I've got to think of its name now, having just said that, in Britain, the Centre for Social Justice, found that the greatest predictor of how well a child will do turns out to be family. And it turns out to be marriage. And it turns out that it doesn't have much to do with wealth or the school you went to. It has far more to do with the home environment that you grew up in. And so in this age of trophy children, when we seem to want to produce children and hold them up to the world and say, here's a little reflection of my values that I've created, rather than say, I will do everything I can in this child's genuine interests, what might those things be? The contrast is extraordinary. It tells a picture, if you like, of another revolution where we are tipping values upside down again. And so it is that I'll conclude by making these observations. We need to again find ways to appeal to our deeper senses of what really stacks up, of what really makes sense, of the desire within ourselves to be noble and other person-centred. None of us are pure. As Solzhenitsyn said, he learnt that the dividing line between good and evil lies not somewhere between a man and a woman, or a black and a white, or a Catholic or a Baptist, but somewhere across every human heart. But for too long we've been playing to our base and selfish instincts. We need to find again that life consists in being outwardly focused, that the modern genre of thinking that says that I will be my own God, that I will look internally for my identity rather than externally, and indeed seek to find myself in the scriptures, which I believe is where you truly find yourself, is failing us very, very badly indeed. And we need to take a deep breath and think again long and hard. So I commend, Bob, the work that you and your team are seeking to do, because in a sense it's selfless. As the authors of this book that I've just mentioned, that I do recommend to you, Katie Faust, Them Before Us, as they have clearly established, we need to find ourselves in serving the next generation properly, not making them serve our ideals of how we'd like to be seen and be perceived. And I have to say to you, I do find the ruling that you put up there, that when you finally got it after the 10 years, is absolutely extraordinary. Have we so lost our marbles that we cannot see that central to any society that has a desire for personal and political and national freedom must start with the proper nurturing of each child? Are we unaware? I recommend Katie Faust's book to you, of the importance of getting the model as right as we can. None of us will do it perfectly, but once we lose sight of the ideal model for raising the next generation, once we abandon that, all hell breaks loose. Thank you very much for having me with you. It's a great privilege. I commend all of you as you seek to hold the line for our children and our grandchildren, everyone that we can save from the sewer that now seems to infest so much of the public debate, so that they can be true and strong and free, makes it worth the effort. Thanks very much.